Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night feeling like something was wrong? I couldn't explain it, but I had a feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. That is exactly what happened to me on the night of July 28, 2016. It was a night like any other, until two gunshots shattered the darkness. I jolted awake. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something was very wrong. The house was silent, no footsteps, no sound of someone running away. Only fear creeping into every inch of my body. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. I just heard gunshots. I tried to stay calm, but my voice betrayed the panic flooding through me. After a few seconds of hesitation, I opened my door and slowly crept down the stairs. The hallway was swallowed in darkness. And then, I saw it. My parents' bedroom door, slightly open. That had never happened before. They always kept their door shut while sleeping. But tonight, it stood ajar, like a silent warning. I froze in place. I couldn't step inside. I didn't want to know what was waiting for me beyond that door. Then the sound of police sirens filled the air. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows. My sister Kara and I stepped outside. But before I could even process what was happening, the police cuffed my hands behind my back. I was in shock. I had just lost my parents. And now I was the suspect? This is only the beginning. If you want to find out what really happened that night, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. I sat motionless in the back of the patrol car, my wrists bound by handcuffs. I looked outside, watching the red and blue lights flash against the walls of the house where I had grown up. Just hours ago, it had been my family home, but now it had become a murder scene. Inside, officers moved around, inspecting every tiny detail. No windows were broken, no signs of forced entry. The security system was fully operational, recording no one entering or leaving. They looked at me, their eyes saying what they didn't need to say out loud. I was the only answer. Inside that house, aside from me and my sister Kara, there were only my parents. Kara was just 12 years old, and my parents were dead. So who else could have done this? They found a .22 caliber handgun lying on the kitchen counter. It was my father's gun, and it was the same gun that had taken my parents' lives. Next to it, a note was discovered, reading, "I've been watching you for some time. Get me." The letters overlapped as if someone had deliberately tried to obscure their handwriting. Was this a threat from an unknown killer, or a staged piece of evidence? The police didn't need to say a word. I could feel their thoughts. They had already made up their minds about who the suspect was. Their search continued, and then, in my room, they found something that made everything worse: a bullet hole in the ceiling. The bullet had pierced through the drywall and landed in my parents' bedroom. When they compared it to the wounds found at the scene, they reached a chilling conclusion. The shot had originated from inside my room. They asked if I knew about it. I shook my head. I had never touched my father's gun. But then, they searched my closet. They found a pillow and a blanket, both with bullet holes. I had no choice but to admit the truth. I shot it once, just to show off. But to the police, this was no longer a joke. Their investigation continued down the second-floor hallway, and this time, they found something even more suspicious: a small burn mark on the carpet near the staircase. The air was thick with the lingering scent of gasoline. Someone had tried to set something on fire here, but for some reason, the flames hadn't spread. Was this an unfinished plan? An attempt to cover up something even more horrific? I felt suffocated. Every detail was working against me. But there was one thing the police couldn't explain. If I was truly the killer, where was the physical proof? There was no gunpowder residue on my hands. There was no blood on my clothes. There was no trace of me trying to wash anything off. No dirty water in the sink. No traces of bleach or cleaning agents in the bathroom. I asked them, if I did this, why is there no evidence proving that I did? But they didn't care. They had already made their decision. My grandmother wept as she watched me being taken away. She couldn't believe I could have done this. She screamed at the officers, insisting that they had arrested the wrong person. Then, my brother Josh arrived, and suddenly the questions turned to him. Josh had a history of mental illness. He had violent thoughts. He had heard voices. Had the police overlooked something? I no longer knew what was real. I no longer knew what to believe. If I didn't do this, then who did? If the security system wasn't tampered with, how did the killer get inside? If there was no one else in the house, what had the police missed? And they weren't looking for anyone else. I was taken back to my cell, feeling like everything around me was crumbling. I didn't know what would happen to me. I didn't know what to do. The only thing I knew was that I was trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. When the police took me into the interrogation room, I felt overwhelmed. Everything was happening too fast. Just a few hours ago, I was a normal teenager living in a happy family. Now I was sitting in a small, cold room, being treated like a murderer. The metal table in front of me was icy to the touch. The fluorescent light above was blindingly bright. I heard the door close behind me, the sound of a pen scribbling on paper, and I could feel the investigators' eyes analyzing my every move. They started with simple questions. What did you do last night? Did you see anyone enter the house? Did you hear anything other than the gunshots? I repeated what I had told 911. I told them I had woken up in the middle of the night, panicked by the sound of gunshots, then went downstairs and saw my parents' bedroom door slightly open. I didn't go inside. I didn't know what was happening. I only called 911 because I needed help, but they didn't believe me. They asked me over and over why I hadn't gone into my parents' room immediately. Didn't you worry about them? If you were really scared, why didn't you run in to check on them? I tried to explain that I was afraid, that I didn't know what I would see, but I realized my answer didn't satisfy them. One of the detectives leaned forward, staring at me as if searching for something in my expression. Then they shifted the focus to the gun. Did you know where your father kept it? Had you ever used it before? I shook my head in denial. But then, they placed a series of photos of my room on the table, a bullet hole in the ceiling, a bullet lodged inside the drywall, a pillow with a gunshot hole. I stared at the images, my heart pounding. They had found it. I had no choice but to admit it. I had handled my father's gun before. I fired it once, just to show off to my friends. But in their eyes, this was no longer just a mistake. Then, they brought up the security system. No one entered or left your house that night. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks. So if no one else could have done this, then who else but you? I started feeling suffocated. I knew I didn't do it, but how could I prove it? One of the detectives slid a folder toward me. Inside were messages between me and my mom. I scanned through those notes, recognizing conversations I never imagined would be used as evidence against me. AJ is a liar. I've never seen anyone like him. I am so disappointed. I closed my eyes, trying to stay calm. My mom had been angry at me before, for a lot of reasons. I had bad grades. I argued with her. I did things that disappointed my parents. But what kid hasn't made mistakes? What parent hasn't been frustrated with their child? I wasn't a perfect son, but that didn't mean I killed my parents. The detectives kept pushing, looking for inconsistencies in my story. You waited 5 hours before telling us you saw an intruder in the house. If you really saw someone, why didn't you mention it right away? I had no answer. I didn't know why. I only knew that I was telling the truth. But to them, it meant my story was changing. Then they asked me, "Do you want to confess?" I almost laughed. Confess to what? I didn't do anything. But I realized they weren't looking for the truth. They already had their answer. Outside the interrogation room, my family was still fighting for me. My grandmother yelled at the officers, insisting that I couldn't have done this. My brother Josh was also mentioned in the investigation. The police knew he had a history of mental illness. They knew he had delusions. They knew he had heard voices. But they didn't pursue that lead. They had their suspect. From the moment this case began, I was caught in its whirlwind. The police had focused on me, interrogated me, and gathered every tiny detail to prove that I was the killer. But there was one thing they didn't care about. If it wasn't me, then who did it? They may have considered other possibilities, but they dismissed them just as quickly. They had a suspect, and they didn't need anyone else. My family disagreed. They didn't believe I was guilty. They wanted to know the truth. Was someone else in the house that night? Was there a motive that we hadn't considered? Then a name came up, Josh Armstrong. My brother, my mother's son from a previous marriage, the man I had always considered my own flesh and blood. Josh had lived in the house, but he had moved out 3 weeks before the murders. During that time, he was staying with his girlfriend, Hannah. Josh wasn't there the night of the murders, but when I called 911, He arrived almost immediately. He heard me say that our parents had been shot, and the first thing he did was grab his gun and run outside. At first, the police didn't suspect Josh, but as the case dragged on, my lawyers dug deeper into his past. And then, they discovered something disturbing. Josh had a severe history of mental illness. His medical records showed that before the murders, he had displayed symptoms of schizophrenia. He heard voices. He had violent thoughts. He even told his girlfriend that there was a woman in his mind that he wanted to kill. And after our parents were murdered, Josh's condition got worse. He suffered from panic attacks, strange dreams, and eventually checked himself into a psychiatric hospital. Then came the moment that stopped everyone in their tracks. During a therapy session, Josh said, "I saw my parents get killed." But he wasn't there that night. His girlfriend had said that he was asleep next to her. But Josh himself said that he had witnessed everything. To my lawyers, this was crucial evidence. How could Josh have witnessed a murder he wasn't present for? Was it a false memory, a delusion, or did he know something that he had never shared? But to the prosecutors, it meant nothing. They argued that Josh was mentally ill. His words were unreliable. They said that his condition worsened after our parents died, but that didn't mean he was the one who killed them. And most importantly, they already had me. Josh was never a suspect, he was never charged. But my family didn't stop there. They wanted to know if the police had overlooked something else. And then, they remembered something strange. My father had once said that he had received threats. My dad wasn't just a former football player. He was also a businessman and a personal trainer. He and my mom ran a gym called First Class Training, and they had invested heavily in it. But not everyone was happy about that. A family friend, Maxine Adams, told my lawyers that my father had been involved in a prostitution ring. She claimed that my father and her husband had connections with some very dangerous people. She believed that the murders weren't random. They were a message, a warning. And then, another strange event. Shortly after the murders, our family's gym was broken into. A group of strangers forced their way inside. They rummaged through everything. But the strange thing was, nothing was stolen. The police investigated, but they found no direct link between the break-in and the murders. So they dismissed the theory. They didn't want to chase something uncertain. They wanted a simple case. And the simplest case was the one where I was the killer. I sat in my cell, thinking about all of this. If it wasn't me, then who killed my parents? What had Josh really seen? Could someone have entered the house without the security system detecting them? Was there a bigger force at play? I had no answers. And the police didn't want answers either. They had a story that fit their version of the truth. But I knew one thing. The truth is never as simple as people want to believe. The first trial took place in 2019. I sat there listening to every accusation the prosecutor threw at me, every piece of evidence they claimed would prove I was guilty. They talked about the text messages between me and my mother. They talked about my bad grades, about the times I had disobeyed my parents, as if that somehow made me a potential murderer. They brought up the gun, the one I had fired once in my room. They pointed to the bullet hole in the ceiling. They relied on the security system, which showed no record of anyone entering or leaving the house that night. In their eyes, everything was simple. I was there. I had a motive, and I did it. But my lawyers fought back. They argued that there was no direct evidence proving I had the gun that night. There was no gunpowder residue on my hands. There was no blood on my clothes. There was no evidence that I had cleaned up anything. If I had committed this crime, where was the proof? The jury listened to both sides. They examined all the evidence. And then, after hours of deliberation, they couldn't reach a verdict. The first trial ended in a deadlock. 8 jurors believed I was guilty, 4 weren't sure, but that didn't mean I was free. The prosecution refused to give up. They decided to put me on trial again. 3 years later, when my second trial began in 2022, I was no longer a 16-year-old kid. I was 23. I was a father now. But no matter how much time had passed, this case still followed me like a shadow. This time, my lawyers took a different approach. They focused on the security system. In the first trial, the prosecution relied on the security records from my home to claim that no one had entered or left that night. But was the system actually reliable? Experts were brought in to testify. They examined data from ADT, the home security company, and discovered that the system had recorded over 70 malfunctions in the month leading up to the murders. Doors had been opened without triggering the sensors. The system had recorded incorrect timestamps. What did that mean? It meant that someone could have entered the house that night, and the system simply failed to record it. The prosecution dismissed the theory. They claimed that while the system had issues, there was no proof that it had failed that specific night. They kept pushing their narrative. If it wasn't you, then who else could have done it? Then, my lawyer said a name: Josh Armstrong. This time, the jury heard about my brother's history of mental illness. They learned that he had delusions, violent thoughts, and had heard voices. They heard that he had once told a psychiatrist that he had witnessed the murders, but the prosecution dismissed it all. They argued that Josh's words weren't reliable, that his mental illness made him an untrustworthy witness. They insisted that since Josh wasn't physically at the crime scene, he couldn't have committed the murders. The jury deadlocked again, but this time the numbers were in my favor. 8 jurors believed I was innocent, only 4 thought I was guilty. I wasn't convicted, but I wasn't free either. The case wasn't over. The prosecution immediately announced they would try me a 3rd time. They refused to let this go. To them, I was a murderer, and they would do anything to prove it. I walked out of the courtroom, but I felt no relief. I knew this wasn't over. Another trial was waiting for me. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. But there was one thing I knew for sure. Until someone was willing to look at this case with true fairness, I would never truly be free. Years have passed, but I am still trapped in this nightmare. 2 trials have ended without a clear verdict, yet the state of Texas refuses to let go. They have decided to put me on trial for the 3rd time. I don't know if this time will be any different, or if I will once again sit there, listening to the prosecutor weave a story that I have no control over. In their eyes, I am still the one who killed my parents. And I know that until a definitive answer is found, I will never truly be free. For nearly a decade, I have lived under the shadow of this case. I have grown up. I have become a father. But my life remains frozen in time, imprisoned by accusations that I cannot escape. The evidence against me has never been conclusive, yet it has also never been weak enough to set me free. I am a free man on paper, but in reality, I am still on trial. So what is the truth? If I didn't do it, then who killed my parents? Does Josh know something he has never told me? Did the security system really fail that night? Or is there still a hidden truth yet to be uncovered? I don't have the answers. But I do know one thing. The truth is never as simple as people want to believe.